There is a moment, perhaps, you know it, when the world stops burning around you, and you realize you are still breathing. The smoke has cleared just enough for you to see where you stand, and what you see is not the landscape you once knew. Everything familiar has been reduced to ash and memory. The carefully constructed geography of your former self lies in ruins. Yet here you are, impossibly present, impossibly alive. You are the survivor of something that was meant to be your ending. Not merely difficult, not simply challenging, but designed, whether by fate, circumstance, or the cruel mathematics of existence, to unmake you completely. And yet, the ultimate paradox has revealed itself. What sought to destroy you has instead become the forge of your becoming. Look around this new terrain with the eyes of an explorer discovering an unmapped continent. The familiar landmarks of your ego are gone. The steady markers by which you once navigated your role, your identity, your understanding of who you were supposed to be have been swept away like houses in a flood. Where once stood the solid structures of certainty, now stretches an open field of possibility, raw and unformed as the first day of creation. This is not the comfortable destruction of change we choose for ourselves, the controlled demolition of old habits or outdated beliefs. This is the kind of unmaking that arrives like a hurricane, indifferent to our preparations, our protests, our desperate bargaining with forces far greater than our will. It is the destruction that mythology speaks of when it tells us of floods that cleanse the world, of fires that burn away everything false, of deaths that must occur before new life can emerge. Carl Jung understood this landscape intimately. He called it the process of individuation, not the gentle self-improvement of popular psychology, but the profound and often devastating journey toward authentic selfhood. It is the hero's journey, stripped of romanticism, revealed as the grinding, transformative work of becoming who you truly are beneath the layers of who you thought you had to be. In the aftermath of survival, you discover that you are both less and more than you imagined. Less, because the grand narratives you told yourself about your strength, your control, your place in the world have been revealed as constructions as fragile as paper houses. More, because in the space where those constructions once stood, something infinitely more real has begun to breathe. The ego, that noble and necessary structure that carried you through the ordinary world, lies wounded but not dead. Like a shell-shocked soldier returning from war, it no longer recognizes the territory it once commanded with such confidence. The maps it relied upon no longer correspond to the terrain. The strategies that once guaranteed success now seem as relevant as instructions for a game no one plays anymore. This disorientation is not failure, it is birth. You are experiencing the fundamental vertigo of transformation, the necessary confusion that accompanies any genuine shift from one state of being to another. The caterpillar, dissolving in the darkness of its cocoon, experiences no gradual transition, but rather a complete breakdown of its former structure before the utterly different architecture of the butterfly can emerge. But you are not merely witnessing this landscape of aftermath, you are inhabiting it, breathing its strange air, learning to walk on ground that feels nothing like the solid earth you once knew. Every step reveals both the devastation of what was lost and the mysterious fertility of what remains. In the places where your old certainties were uprooted, new possibilities are already taking root, though they may be too tender yet to name. The psychological terrain of survival is unlike any other inner geography. It is a place where ordinary time seems suspended, where the linear progression from past to future gives way to something more circular, more eternal. Yesterday feels both impossibly distant and immediately present. Tomorrow appears both urgent and irrelevant. You exist in the eternal now of aftermath, in the sacred pause between the lightning strike and the thunder. This is the realm that and mystics have always known. The space between worlds where healing happens, not through the restoration of what was, but through the emergence of what could never have existed without the destruction. It is the psychological equivalent of the burned forest, where certain seeds can only germinate in soil enriched by ash, where new growth emerges more vibrant and resilient than what came before. Yet this is not a comfortable wisdom. The survivors' landscape is lonely territory, difficult to explain to those who still inhabit the solid ground of their unbroken lives. How do you describe the view from the other side of catastrophe to someone who has never been forced to cross that threshold? How do you convey the strange liberation that accompanies the complete collapse of everything you thought you needed? To be. The ancient Greeks had a word in anchodromia which Jung adopted to describe the tendency of things to transform into their opposites when pushed to extremes. What was meant to destroy you has become the source of your most authentic power. What was intended to diminish you has revealed depths of resilience you never knew you possessed. What sought to silence you has given you a voice that carries the authority of someone who has been to the edge and returned with news from the frontier. This is not the manufactured resilience of motivational slogans, the forced optimism that insists on finding silver linings in every storm cloud. This is something far more ancient and far more real, the deep knowledge that lives in the bones of every creature that has faced extinction and survived. The cellular memory of renewal that connects you to every phoenix that has ever risen from its own ashes. You stand now in the landscape after the storm, and you are learning a new language. It is the language of paradox, where endings and beginnings are revealed as the same event, seen from different angles, where loss and gain dance together in patterns too complex for the rational mind to untangle, where the question is no longer how to return to who you were, but how to honor the magnificent and terrible process of becoming who you are. The raw materials of transformation lie scattered around you like the components of a sculpture waiting to be born from stone. Nothing is wasted here. Every scar is a sacred text. Every wound is a doorway. Every broken piece is simultaneously a memorial to what was lost and a building block for what will emerge. This is where your real story begins, not in the comfortable chapters of your former life, but here, in the space between destruction and creation, where the most profound transformations always take place. Here, where the old maps have been burned and new territories are waiting to be explored. Here, where you learn that surviving what was meant to destroy you is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a narrative so much faster and more authentic than anything you could have imagined from the safety of your former shore. Welcome to the landscape after the storm. Welcome to the geography of becoming. Welcome to the sacred territory of your own transformation, where every breath is both a small death and a small rebirth, where every moment offers the possibility of emerging more truly yourself than you have ever been before. In the beginning, there is only the raw matter of existence, screwed, unformed, heavy as lead in the soul's palm. You have entered the alchemist's laboratory now, though you may not recognize it as such. The crucible is your own psyche, and the fire that burns beneath it is the very suffering you have tried so desperately to escape. But listen closely, for in this sacred chamber of transformation, nothing is as it appears. The ancient alchemists knew what modern consciousness has forgotten, that destruction and creation are not opposites, but lovers locked in an eternal dance. They called the first stage, Nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the necessary decay that must precede all rebirth. You have lived in this darkness, perhaps for years, watching as everything you believed yourself to be dissolved into shadow and uncertainty. The persona you wore so carefully, the mask that made you acceptable to the world, has cracked and fallen away, leaving you naked before the mirror of your own truth. This is not failure. This is the beginning of the great work. Survival, you see, is never merely about endurance. The body may persist, the heart may continue its rhythmic beating, but true survival, the kind that transforms lead into gold, occurs in the depths of the unconscious, where the ego must learn to die 1,000 small deaths before it can be reborn as something larger, something more authentic, something infinitely more alive. Jung understood this process intimately, for he lived it himself in those crucial years, when his own psyche descended into what seemed like madness, but was, in truth, the deepest sanity, the sanity of surrender to the self's greater wisdom. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious, but we might also call it his initiation into the mysteries of becoming fully human. The alchemical vessel of your being has been sealed, and the heat has been applied. Everything that seemed solid has begun to liquefy. Your certainties melt, your beliefs bubble and foam. The fixed stars of your identity blur and shift in the night sky of your awareness. This is terrifying, yes, but it is also necessary. The old king must die before the new king can be crowned. Consider the Ouroboros, that ancient symbol of the serpent eating its own tail, destruction and creation unified in a single, eternal gesture. Your survival has this same circular quality. You consume your own suffering, digest it, transform it into wisdom. The very poison that threatened to destroy you becomes the medicine that heals you. This is not metaphor. This is the literal truth of psychological transformation. The shadow that rejected, disowned aspect of yourself that you have spent a lifetime trying to escape emerges, now with particular force during this alchemical process. It is no longer content to lurk in the periphery of your awareness. It demands recognition, integration, acceptance. The parts of yourself you have labeled as weak, shameful, unacceptable, rise up from the depths like ancient gods reclaiming their temples. You may have noticed that in your darkest moments, qualities emerge that surprise you. Strength where you expected weakness. Fury, we've cultivated gentleness. Wisdom where you felt only confusion. These are not aberrations. They are the raw materials of your wholeness returning to consciousness. The shadow is not your enemy. It is the abandoned twin of your light, and it carries gifts you have long forgotten you possessed. In the alchemical tradition, they spoke of the union of opposites, the conjunction oppositora mass, the central mystery of transformation. Soul and luna, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, creation and destruction must be wed within the sacred chamber of your being. This wedding cannot occur through force or will. It happens only through surrender, through allowing the natural intelligence of the psyche to orchestrate its own healing. The ego, that precious sense of separate self that has carried you this far in life, recoils from this process. It wants to maintain control, to direct the transformation according to its limited understanding. But the ego is not the alchemist, it is merely the apprentice, learning to serve a wisdom far greater than its own. The true alchemist is the self, that archetypal organizing principle that Jung recognized as the God image within the human psyche. As you move through this crucible of Survival. You begin to recognize that your suffering has never been random or meaningless. It has followed certain patterns, certain themes, like variations on a musical composition written by your own soul. The losses that devastated you, the betrayals that shattered your trust, the failures that brought you to your message, was precisely calibrated to crack open what needed to be cracked open, to dissolve what needed to be dissolved. This recognition does not minimize your pain or justify the harm that may have been done to you, but it places that pain within a larger context, a cosmic context, where even the darkest experiences serve the soul's deeper intention to become whole. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the self as the God within, not some distant deity, but the organizing intelligence that guides your individuation, with a precision that exceeds your conscious comprehension. The alchemical opus unfolds in stages, each with its own necessary anguish and its own specific gifts. After the Nigredo comes the albedo, the whitening, the purification, where new consciousness begins to emerge from the chaos of dissolution. You may have glimpsed this stage already. Moments of unexpected clarity that pierce through the fog of confusion, instants of profound peace that arise without cause or effort. These are not fantasies or temporary reprieves from your suffering. They are authentic glimpses of your emerging authentic self, your individuated being that is gradually crystallizing from the prima materia of your dissolved old identity. Like the alchemist's white queen, this purified consciousness carries a different quality than the ego consciousness you once knew. It is simultaneously more humble and more powerful, more uncertain and more trusting. The final stage, the rubedo, or reddening, represents the emergence of the philosopher's stone, that legendary substance that could transmute base metals into gold. In psychological terms, this is the integrated personality, the individuated self that has incorporated both light and shadow, both conscious and unconscious, both personal and transpersonal elements into a unified whole. But do not mistake this for some final achievement, some permanent state of enlightenment. The alchemical process is cyclical, recursive, spiral. Each time you encounter a new challenge, a new loss, a new threshold of growth, the vessel is sealed again, the fire is rekindled, and the great work continues at a deeper level. Your survival, then, is not about returning to who you were before the crisis began. That person, that identity, was necessarily incomplete. Was the crisis would not have been needed. Your survival is about becoming who you have always potentially been, but could never have become without passing through this particular crucible, without experiencing this specific dissolution and reconstitution. The ancient alchemists worked in secret, hidden away in their laboratories, because they understood that this work of transformation is both sacred and dangerous. It requires protection from the judgments and misunderstandings of a world that values only the finished product, never the messy process of becoming. You, too, may need to guard this process carefully to create sacred space around your own becoming. Trust the intelligence that is orchestrating this transformation, even when, especially when you cannot understand its methods. The psyche knows how to heal itself, just as the body knows how to mend a broken bone. Your role is not to direct this healing, but to provide the conditions that allow it to unfold: patience, self-compassion, and the willingness to remain present to whatever arises. The gold that emerges from your alchemical crucible will not be the fool's gold of a perfected persona or an inflated ego. It will be the genuine gold of authentic being, scarred, perhaps, but radiant, wounded, but wise, broken open, but infinitely more spacious, than the closed container you once believed yourself to be. This is the alchemy of survival, not merely enduring what life brings, but allowing yourself to be transformed by it, to become the gold that was always hidden within the lead of your ordinary consciousness. The philosopher's stone is not something you create, it is something you become, something you always were, waiting patiently beneath the surface for the right conditions to emerge. And those conditions, dear soul, have been met. The vessel is sealed. The fire burns bright. The great work of your becoming continues, moment by moment, breath by breath. In the eternal now of your ever-transforming awareness, there comes a moment in every soul's journey when the carefully constructed edifice of who we believed ourselves to be simply ... collapses. Not gradually, like the slow erosion of a riverbank, but suddenly, catastrophically, like a dam bursting under the relentless pressure of accumulated truth. The masks we have worn so long, they felt like skin. The roles we have played with such conviction, they became our identity. The persona we crafted to navigate the treacherous waters of human expectational, of it crumbles in an instant, leaving us standing in the rubble of our former self. Picture, if you will, an actor who has performed the same character for decades, so immersed in the role that the boundary between performer and performance has dissolved entirely. Then, one fateful evening, midway through the familiar soliloquy, the theater lights suddenly blaze to full intensity, the curtain falls away, and the audience vanishes into shadow. What remains is not the character, but a human being blinking. In harsh light, script forgotten, costume hanging loose, makeup smeared with the salt of unexpected tears. This is the moment of persona's shattering, when the protective shell that has housed our tender authenticity finally cracks beyond repair. Jung understood this threshold as both ending and beginning, death and birth occurring simultaneously in the crucible of consciousness. The persona, that adaptive mask we don each morning like armor, serves its purpose in the first half of life. It helps us navigate social expectations, professional demands, family roles, cultural norms. It is the diplomat of the psyche, smoothing rough edges, translating our inner chaos into acceptable outer form. But like all protective mechanisms, it can become a prison if we mistake it for our true nature. The shattering rarely arrives as a gentle invitation. More often, it crashes into our carefully ordered existence, like a meteor through atmosphere, expected, devastating, transformative. Perhaps it comes through the sudden loss of a role that defined us, the executive who loses their position, the parent whose children leave home, the spouse whose marriage dissolves, the athlete whose body betrays them. Or it may arrive through illness, forcing us to confront our mortality and the fragility of the identity we've constructed. Sometimes it emerges through a crisis of meaning, a dark night of the soul where the scripts we've been reading from suddenly appear foreign, meaningless, hollow. When the persona shatters, we find ourselves in what the mystics call the naked moment, exposed, vulnerable, stripped of the familiar garments of selfhood. It is terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Terrifying because we discover how much of our sense of self was borrowed, constructed, performed, rather than genuinely lived. Liberating because in this exposure, we glimpse for the first time the authentic being that has been waiting beneath the costume all along. The fragments of the broken persona lie scattered around us like pieces of an ancient vase, each shard reflecting distorted images of who we thought we were. Here lies the piece of us that was always the responsible one. There the fragment that knew how to charm and please. Over there the portion that never showed weakness or uncertainty. We may find ourselves mourning these lost aspects, grieving not just for the comfort they provided, but for the coherent story they told about our place in the world. Yet, in this apparent destruction, lies the seed of the most profound creation. For the authentic self, what Jung called the true self, with a capital S, cannot emerge while it remains imprisoned within the persona's limiting structure. Like a butterfly that must dissolve entirely within the chrysalis before it can take wing. We must allow the old form to completely break down before the new can take shape. This is the paradox that modern psychology often misses. We must become nobody before we can become somebody real. We must experience the ego's death before we can be reborn into authentic selfhood. The persona's shattering is not a failure of psychological development, but its necessary fulfillment. It is the soul's way of saying, you have grown too large for this container. It is time to inhabit the fullness of who you actually are. In the immediate aftermath of the shattering, we may feel like survivors of a psychic earthquake, standing amidst the ruins of our former life, unsure of what to rebuild or even whether rebuilding is possible. The familiar landmarks of identity have been erased. The internal compass that once oriented us toward appropriate thoughts, feelings, and behaviors spins wildly, unable to find true north. We may experience what Jung termed disorientation, a profound uncertainty about who we are and how we are supposed to exist in the world. This disorientation, while deeply uncomfortable, is actually a sign of health. It indicates that we are no longer content to live inauthentically, no longer willing to sacrifice our true nature on the altar of social acceptability. The very discomfort we feel is the growing pain of an expanded consciousness, like a snake that has outgrown its skin and must endure the vulnerable process of molting. During this liminal time, we may find ourselves oscillating between profound loss and unexpected freedom. One moment we mourn the security and certainty that the persona provided. The next we feel giddy with the possibility of living without pretense. We may catch glimpses of ourselves in mirrors and not recognize the person looking back, not because we have changed externally, but because the lens through which we view ourselves has been shattered and is slowly being replaced by something far more truthful. The people around us often struggle to understand this transformation. They may attempt to help us reconstruct the familiar persona, offering comfort that feels more like suffocation, advice that sounds hollow, encouragement to get back to normal when normal no longer exists. Well-meaning friends and family members may become confused or even frightened by our apparent disintegration, not recognizing it as the natural process of psychological evolution. This is when we must learn to trust the wisdom of breakdown, to honor the intelligence of dissolution. Just as a forest fire, while devastating, clears away the undergrowth and allows new growth to emerge, the shattering of the persona creates space for aspects of ourselves that have long been suppressed or denied. Qualities that didn't fit the old image: creativity, vulnerability, anger, joy, wildness, tenderness begin to surface like flowers pushing through cracked concrete. We discover that beneath the polished surface of our persona, we are far more complex, contradictory, and interesting than we ever imagined. The shadow aspects we kept hidden, not just the dark qualities, but also the golden ones that didn't fit our self-concept, begin to integrate into our conscious awareness. We may find ourselves laughing at inappropriate moments, crying without clear reason, expressing opinions we didn't know we held, feeling attracted to experiences we previously avoided. This is the beginning of what Jung called individuation. lifelong process of becoming who we truly are, rather than who we think we should be. It is not a return to some original, pure state of being, but rather a movement toward wholeness that encompasses both light and shadow, both the acceptable and the taboo aspects of our nature. We begin to understand that authenticity is not about perfection, but about integration, not about being good, but about being real. The path forward from the persona's shattering is neither quick nor linear. We cannot simply decide to construct a new, improved version of our former self. Instead, we must learn to live in the uncertainty, to dwell in the questions, rather than rushing toward answers. We must develop what Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in doubt and mystery without irritably reaching after fact and reason. In this space of not knowing, we begin to hear the quiet voice of our authentic self, not the loud, demanding voice of the ego or the socially conditioned voice of the persona, but the subtle, trustworthy voice of our deepest truth. This voice may whisper of dreams long abandoned, of paths not taken, of aspects of life we've been too afraid or too conditioned to explore. It may speak in images rather than words, in intuitions rather than logical thoughts, in feelings rather than concepts. Learning to trust this inner voice requires courage of the highest order. It means potentially disappointing others, challenging expectations, stepping outside the safe boundaries of conventional life. It means accepting that we may be misunderstood, judged, or rejected by those who preferred us in our former, more predictable form. But it also means the possibility of experiencing life with an immediacy, authenticity, and depth that was impossible while hiding behind the mask. As we gradually learn to navigate this new landscape of selfhood, we may find that our relationships begin to shift. Some connections, built primarily on our persona-based interactions, may struggle to adapt to our increased authenticity. Others may deepen in ways we never imagined possible, as we discover that vulnerability, rather than perfection, is what creates genuine intimacy. We may attract new people into our lives, who are drawn not to what we can do for them, or how we make them feel, but to the simple truth of who we are. The shattering of the persona also transforms our relationship with solitude, where once we may have feared being alone with ourselves, preferring the distraction of constant activity or the validation of others' attention. We begin to discover the profound companionship of our own authentic presence. We learn that we are far more interesting than our persona ever suggested, far more complex and capable of growth than our old self-concept allowed. This is not to say that we abandon all social adaptation or refuse to play any roles in life. The goal is not to become completely unfiltered or socially unconscious, but rather to develop what we might call a conscious persona, one that serves authentic expression rather than hiding it, one that adapts to circumstances while remaining rooted in truth. We learn to wear our social roles lightly, like clothes that can be changed according to the weather but never mistaken for our skin. The person who emerges from the persona's shattering is both more humble and more confident than before. More humble because they have experienced the fragility of all constructed identities, the illusory nature of the ego's grandiose projects. More confident because they have touched something unshakable beneath all the surface changes, the bedrock of authentic being that no external circumstances can truly threaten. This transformation is not a destination, but a doorway. The shattering of the persona marks the end of the first half of life's journey, the phase dominated by building, achieving, adapting, succeeding, according to external measures. It signals the beginning of the second half, the phase dedicated to meaning, depth, integration, and the gradual embodiment of our fullest human potential. In the end, we come to understand that the persona's shattering was not a catastrophe, to be avoided but a necessary initiation into authentic adulthood. It was the soul's way of insisting on truth, of demanding that we stop settling for a life half-lived. The broken fragments of our former self become the raw material for something far more beautiful, not a perfect image, but a genuine human being capable of both great tenderness and fierce truth, both deep solitude and authentic connection. Standing now in the clear light of this new awareness, we can look back at the rebel of our former persona, not with regret, but with gratitude. Those masks served their purpose, protected us when protection was needed, helped us navigate the early stages of our human becoming, but they were never meant to be permanent dwellings, only temporary shelters. While our true home was being built in the depths of our being, the journey beyond the personas, shattering, will require everything we have, and more: courage, patience, compassion for ourselves and others, willingness to live in uncertainty, faith in processes we cannot fully understand, but it promises something that no amount of external success or social approval could ever provide: the profound satisfaction of living as who we truly are, the deep peace of alignment between inner truth and outer expression, the unshakable foundation of authentic selfhood upon which a meaningful life can finally be built. There comes a moment in the descent when you encounter a face you do not recognize, yet know intimately, a face that wears your features but carries the weight of survival's darkest truths. This is not the shadow Jung spoke of in comfortable consultation rooms, the repressed desires and unlived possibilities of ordinary existence. No, this is something far more primal, more ancient. This is the shadow born of survival itself, forged in the crucible of circumstances that stripped away every pretense, every civilized veneer, every comfortable lie about who you though or you were. In the psychology of extremity, when the familiar world collapses and the rules of ordinary life no longer apply, something awakens within us that civilization has long sought to tame. It is the part of the psyche that knows how to endure when endurance seems impossible, how to make choices that would horrify our former selves, how to find strength in places we never knew existed. This shadow carries not just the darkness of what we witnessed, but the fierce, untamed wisdom of what we became in order to survive. Picture yourself standing before a mirror that reflects not your current face, but the face you wore in your deepest extremity. See how the eyes have changed. They hold a knowledge that cannot be unlearned, a recognition of capacities that cannot be forgotten. These are the eyes of someone who has looked into the abyss and discovered not just that the abyss looks back, but that something within you looks back with it, unblinking, unashamed, alive. The survivor's shadow is paradoxical in nature. It contains both the brutality we discovered we were capable of and the profound tenderness we found in our ability to endure. It holds the moments when we acted from pure instinct, beyond the reach of moral consideration, and also the moments when we chose to remain human despite every reason to abandon that choice. This shadow knows the savage mathematics of survival: what must be sacrificed, what must be preserved, what must be done regardless of consequence. In Jungian terms, the shadow represents those aspects of the personality that the ego rejects or remains unconscious of. But the shadow born of survival transcends this simple definition. It encompasses not just what we rejected, but what circumstances forced us to embrace. It includes not only our capacity for darkness, but our resilience in the face of that darkness. It is simultaneously our shame and our strength, our wound and our weapon. When you first encountered the shadow, the temptation is to recoil, to push it back into the unconscious depths where it emerged from. The civilized mind rebels against acknowledging the primitive wisdom the shadow carries. We want to believe that our survival was noble, that we maintained our principles intact, that we emerged unchanged from the crucible. But the shadow knows better. It remembers every compromise, every moment of necessary brutality, every time we chose survival over sentiment. Yet to reject the shadow is to reject the very part of ourselves that ensured our continuance. It is to deny the fierce intelligence that navigated impossible circumstances, the primal strength that endured when everything else failed. This shadow is not a mistake to be corrected or a darkness to be eliminated. It is an integral part of the psyche's response to extremity, a manifestation of the life force, itself refusing to be extinguished. The integration of the survivor's shadow requires a different kind of courage than ordinary shadow work demands. It asks us to acknowledge not just our capacity for darkness, but our necessity of it. It demands that we face the uncomfortable truth that survival sometimes requires us to become someone we never thought we could be, to make choices that violate every moral principle we held sacred, to discover resources within ourselves that both appall and astonish us. This shadow speaks a language older than civilization, a primal dialect of necessity and instinct. It reminds us that beneath the layers of cultural conditioning, social expectation, and moral education lies something wild and untamed, something that knows how to endure when endurance is the only option. It carries the wisdom of the body's intelligence, the psyche's adaptive capacity, the soul's refusal to surrender, even when surrender seems the only rational choice. Consider the myths and stories that have always recognized this primitive wisdom. Tales of heroes who must ascend into the underworld, warriors who must embrace their shadow to defeat their enemies, survivors who must become something other than human in order to remain human. These stories understand what civilized psychology often forgets, that transformation sometimes requires us to embrace precisely those aspects of ourselves we have been conditioned to fear. The survivor's shadow also carries a profound loneliness, for it knows truths that cannot be easily shared with those who have never faced such extremity. It holds experiences that isolate, even as they empower, memories that set one apart from the comfortable assumptions of ordinary life. This shadow knows what it means to be alone with impossible choices, to carry the weight of decisions made in circumstances where there were no correct answers, only necessary ones. Yet within this loneliness lies a strange kind of freedom. The shadow born of survival has moved beyond the need for external validation, beyond the comfort of moral certainty, beyond the luxury of idealistic principles. It has touched something essential about the nature of existence itself, the recognition that life is simultaneously more fragile and more resilient than we ever imagined, that the human spirit contains capacities for both destruction and endurance that defy comprehension. To integrate this shadow is not to glorify violence or abandon ethical consideration. Rather, it is to acknowledge the full spectrum of human capacity, to recognize that survival sometimes demands we access parts of ourselves that civilized life keeps dormant. It is to understand that the same force that enabled our survival in extremity continues to live within us, not as a relic of past trauma, but as an ongoing source of strength and wisdom. This integration process is like learning to see in a new spectrum of light. Suddenly, you perceive aspects of reality that were always present but previously invisible. You recognize the subtle signs of potential threat and opportunity that your survivor's shadow learned to read. You feel the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you have endured the unendurable and can do so again if necessary. You carry yourself differently, speak with a different authority, make decisions from a deeper place of knowing. The shadow born of survival ultimately teaches us about the sacred nature of our own resilience. It reveals that we are far more than we believed ourselves to be, capable of far more than we ever imagined. It shows us that the human spirit contains multitudes, not just the light we prefer to acknowledge, but the darkness that sometimes preserves that light. It demonstrates that true strength lies not in the absence of darkness, but in the conscious integration of all aspects of our nature. In embracing this shadow, we reclaim the wild, untamed parts of ourselves that society taught us to fear. We acknowledge the warrior within the wounded, the survivor within the victim, the fierce intelligence within the traumatized psyche. We learn to honor not just who we were before our trials, but who we became through them, and we discover that this becoming was itself a form of sacred transformation, a death and rebirth that revealed capacities we never knew we possessed. There comes a time in the survivor's journey when the landscape stretches endlessly in all directions, empty of familiar landmarks, devoid of the signposts that once pointed toward purpose. You have emerged from the fire of destruction, yes, but what greets you on the other side is not the promised land of recovery. It is the wasteland, that vast psychological desert where meaning itself has become a casualty of survival. T.S. Eliot knew this terrain when he wrote of April as the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of dead land. He understood that sometimes the most devastating aftermath is not the initial destruction, but the slow recognition that the symbols which once gave life its sacred geometry have crumbled to dust. The cross that once pointed skyward, the compass that once indicated true north, the constellation of beliefs that once mapped the territory of your soul, lie scattered like the bones of a civilization that perished in some forgotten apocalypse. This is not the comfortable emptiness of a quiet moment, or the chosen simplicity of meditation. This is the howling void that opens when the very foundations of meaning have been excavated by forces beyond your control. The stories you told yourself about why things happen, about what matters, about what makes a life worth living, these narratives lie in fragments around you, and no amount of careful reconstruction can restore their former power to orient and inspire in this desert of significance. You discover that meaning is not the solid, eternal thing you once believed it to be. It is not carved in stone tablets or written in the stars with permanent ink. Meaning, you learn with a shock that reverberates through every cell of your being, is as fragile as morning mist, as vulnerable to destruction as any other human creation. The earthquake that shattered your external world has revealed that your internal world was built on foundations no more solid than sand. Yet Jung understood that the wasteland is not punishment, is preparation. The emptying must occur before the filling can begin. The old meanings must die before new ones can be born. Like the alchemist's vessel, heated until all impurities are burned away. The psyche must sometimes be reduced to its essential elements before a more authentic form of significance can crystallize from the void. You wander now through this psychological Sahara, and every step raises questions that have no easy answers. What is the point of continuing when the very concept of purpose has been revealed as illusion? How do you move forward when all directions appear equally meaningless? Why does anything matter when you have seen how quickly everything that seems to matter can be swept away like sandcastles before the tide? These are not philosophical questions to be answered with clever reasoning. They are existential winds that strip you bare, forcing you to confront the fundamental mystery of human existence without the protective shelter of inherited beliefs. In the wasteland, you cannot borrow meaning from others or purchase it from the marketplace of ideas. Here, significance must be earned through the most ancient and demanding of processes, the descent into the darkness of unknowing, and the patient, waiting for new light to dawn. The bones scattered in this desert are not merely the remains of your former beliefs. They are also the fossilized remnants of collective meanings that once sustained entire civilizations. You walk among the archaeological layers of humanity's attempts to make sense of existence, from the most primitive rituals to the most sophisticated philosophies. All have their season, and all, eventually, return to dust. But observe more carefully, and you begin to notice something that transforms your understanding of this apparent desolation. The wasteland is not truly empty, is pregnant with possibility. In the spaces between the scattered bones, in the silence between the howling winds, something is gestating. New meaning does not arrive like a package delivered to your door. It emerges like water seeping up from underground springs, like shoots of grass pushing through concrete, like stars becoming visible only after the false lights of the city have been extinguished. This emergence cannot be forced or hurried. It follows the ancient rhythms of creation itself, which always begins with darkness, with void, with the fertile emptiness that precedes all birth. The wasteland teaches you to become comfortable with not knowing, to develop a capacity for uncertainty that your former meaning system never required. You learn to sit with questions instead of rushing toward answers, to inhabit the space between what was and what will be in this desert. You discover that meaning was never something you participated in. The old meanings felt solid because you had never been forced to examine their foundations. Now, stripped of these inherited certainties, you must learn the more demanding art of meaning-making itself, the conscious collaboration with the forces that weave significance from the raw material of experience, the symbols that once organized your world's success, security, relationship, achievement, even survival itself, revealed themselves as provisional constructions, useful but not ultimate. In their absence, you begin to sense older symbols stirring in the depths of the psyche, archetypal images that connect you not to the temporary arrangements of culture, but to the eternal patterns that underlie all human experience. Sometimes, in the deep stillness of the wasteland, you catch glimpses of these emerging constellations. They appear first as intuitions, as dreams that feel more real than waking life, as moments of recognition when you encounter something that resonates in frequencies older than language, a particular quality of light, a fragment of music, a simple gesture of compassion. These become doorways through which new meaning seeps into consciousness, like water returning to a drought-stricken land. The wasteland teaches you that meaning is not a thing to be found, but a relationship to be cultivated. It cannot be grasped or hoarded. It can only be received and honored. It emerges not from the ego's desperate need for significance, but from the deeper self's willingness to participate in the mystery of existence itself, in learning to wait, to listen, to remain open in the face of apparent emptiness. You develop capacities that your meaning-filled former life never required. This is the paradox of the wasteland. It is simultaneously the most barren and the most fertile territory of the human experience. Here, stripped of all the comforting illusions about what life means, you encounter the possibility of meanings so much more authentic and profound than anything you could have imagined from the safety of your former certainties. The wasteland does not last forever, but its lessons endure. You learn that meaning is not something you have, but something you are. Not a possession to be protected, but a process to be trusted. You discover that the most authentic significance often emerges from the places where meaning seemed most thoroughly destroyed. Like flowers blooming in the cracks of broken pavement, like hope arising from the soil of despair. In the vastness of this psychological desert, you begin to understand that you are not lost, you are being found. Not by returning to old meanings, but by allowing new ones to find you in the darkness, to constellate around the authentic core of who you are becoming, rather than the artificial structure of who you thought you had to be. The wasteland of meaning is not the end of significance, it is its laboratory, its birthplace, its sacred ground. Here, in the apparent emptiness, the most essential meanings are distilled from the essence of what it means to be human, to survive, to transform, and, ultimately, to become. There is an ancient wound that never fully heals, and within that very wound lies a medicine unlike any other. You who have survived what was meant to destroy you carry within your scars a healing power that can only be born from the deepest places of suffering transformed. This is not the comfortable wisdom of books or the theoretical knowledge of those who have studied pain from a safe distance. This is the hard-won medicine that emerges only when you have descended into your own underworld and returned with treasures that cannot be found anywhere else. The Greeks knew this mystery in the figure of Chiron, the wounded centaur who became the greatest healer of his age. Shot by an arrow dipped in the hydra's poison, he carried a wound that would never fully close, yet from this very wound came his extraordinary ability to heal others. Chiron's medicine was not despite his wound, but because of it distilled from the poison of his own unending pain, refined through his intimate knowledge of suffering, authenticated by his daily experience of what it means to live with injury that transforms but never completely disappears. You are becoming Chiron. Perhaps you have not recognized it yet, this slow metamorphosis from victim to healer, from one who suffered to one who serves. The transformation is subtle, underground, like the way mycorrhizal networks spread beneath the forest floor, connecting tree to tree in a vast web of mutual support that remains invisible until you learn to see with different eyes as it begins. With a shift so slight, you might dismiss it as imagination. Someone in pain gravitates toward you in ways they did not before. Conversations that once remained on the surface suddenly dive deep without explanation. People find themselves telling you things they have never told anyone, as if some invisible signal broadcasts from your being, announcing, here is someone who understands the geography of devastation, who knows the landmarks of the broken places, who can serve as guide in territories where most fear to travel. This is not because you have become wise in the conventional sense, not because you have collected insights like trophies or developed theories about the nature of suffering. It is because your very presence has been alchemically altered by your journey through the fire. Like metal refined in the forge, you now carry a different frequency, resonate at a pitch that others who have been similarly tested can recognize at levels deeper than conscious awareness. The wounded healer archetype does not emerge through intention or ambition. You cannot decide to become one, any more than you can decide to become tall or to change the color of your eyes. It is a vocation that chooses you, arising from the mysterious alchemy that occurs when deep suffering meets deep surrender, when the ego's desperate attempts to avoid pain finally give way to a more profound acceptance of what has been and what is. This acceptance does not mean resignation or passive endurance. It means something far more active and transformative, the willingness to allow your wound to become a sacred vessel, a holy grail, that can hold and transform not only your own suffering, but the suffering of others who will inevitably cross your path. It means learning to see your pain not as punishment or proof of cosmic injustice, but as initiation into mysteries that can only be understood from the inside. Jung understood that the wounded healer represents one of the most profound expressions of the individuation process. It is the psyche's way of transforming personal tragedy into transpersonal service, of alchemically converting the lead of suffering into the gold of wisdom that benefits not just the individual, but the collective human experience. The wounded healer becomes a bridge between worlds, the world of those who have not yet faced ultimate testing, and the world of those who have passed through the fire and emerged transformed. But this bridging is not without its challenges. The wounded healer occupies a liminal space, belonging fully to neither world. Those who have not been tested may view you with a mixture of admiration and incomprehension, grateful for your help but unable to fully understand the depths from which your medicine emerges. Those who are still in the midst of their own testing may see in you either hope or a reminder of how far they still have to travel. There is a loneliness inherent in this calling, the solitude of one who has seen what cannot be unseen, known what cannot be unknown. The wounded healer carries within their being the knowledge that life can and will shatter in ways that leave nothing of the former self intact. And this knowledge creates a kind of existential vertigo that never completely disappears. You live simultaneously in the world of ordinary concerns and in the vast space of ultimate questions, and the tension between these realities becomes a creative force that generates the very medicine you have to offer. The healing you provide is not the kind that promises to make everything as it was before. The wounded healer knows too intimately that some things, once broken, cannot and should not be repaired, but must be transformed into something entirely new. Your medicine is not restoration, but resurrection, not the healing that returns people to their previous state, but the healing that guides them through their own death and rebirth into a more authentic and resilient form of being. This medicine works through presence more than through words, through resonance more than through technique. When someone in the depths of their own destruction encounters you, they sense at levels deeper than language that here is someone who has been where they are, who has navigated the territory they are struggling to cross. Your very existence becomes proof that it is possible to survive what feels unsurvivable, to emerge from what seems like certain destruction, not merely intact, but somehow more real, more present, more alive than before. The wounded healer learns to hold space for others' pain without trying to fix it, to be with suffering without rushing toward solutions. You develop a tolerance for ambiguity, for the messy middle spaces of transformation where things are neither all better nor all worse, but caught in the complex dance of becoming. Your medicine is the medicine of witness, of companionship in the dark places, of gentle guidance based not on theory but on lived experience of the territory. Sometimes the healing you offer is simply the demonstration that it is possible to carry wounds without being destroyed by them, to integrate trauma without being consumed by it. Other times, it is the specific knowledge you have gained about navigating particular forms of devastation, the practical wisdom of someone who has learned the hard way what helps and what hurts, what heals and what perpetuates harm. But perhaps, most importantly, the wounded healer offers something that can only be given by one who has made the full journey from destruction to transformation. The deep knowing that what appears to be ending is often actually beginning, that what feels like death is frequently the gateway to a more authentic form of life. That the very experiences that seem to disqualify us from participation in ordinary existence may actually be preparing us for extraordinary service. The call of the wounded healer is not always comfortable to answer. It requires a level of vulnerability that the ego resists, a willingness to remain open to others' pain when every instinct might be screaming for self-protection. It means learning to trust that your wounds have become sources of strength rather than simply sites of damage, that your scars tell stories worth hearing rather than shameful secrets to be hidden. This calling also demands rigorous self-care and continuous inner work. The wounded healer who does not tend to their own healing becomes depleted, burned out, eventually unable to serve effectively. There is a delicate balance between using your wounds as sources of medicine and allowing them to become infected through neglect or overuse. The wise wounded healer learns to honor both their capacity to serve and their need for renewal, understanding that sustainable healing work requires ongoing attention to one's own therapeutic process. As you grow into this archetypal role, you begin to recognize others who carry the same calling. You spot them by the particular quality of depth in their eyes, the way they listen with their whole being, the manner in which they hold space for complexity without rushing towards simple answers. A network of wounded healers exists across all cultures and throughout all time. Shamans and therapists, artists and activists, spiritual teachers and grief counselors, all united by the common experience of having their own suffering become a source of service to others. The wounded healer represents one of humanity's most ancient and essential functions. In indigenous cultures, the shaman was often someone who had been called to the role through illness, vision, or encounter with forces that dissolved ordinary reality. Their healing power came not from having avoided suffering, but from having survived it and learned to work with the very forces that had once threatened to destroy them. In our modern world, this archetype manifests in countless forms. The addiction counselor who speaks with the authority of recovery, the grief therapist who has walked the valley of their own loss, the trauma specialist who has integrated their own history of abusal, are expressions of the wounded healer. All carry medicine distilled from the poison of their own experience. Your emergence into this role is not a consolation prize for having suffered, not a cosmic attempt to balance the scales of justice. It is recognition of something profound about the nature of human experience itself, that our deepest wounds, when met with courage and grace, can become our greatest gifts to the world. The wounded healer embodies the fundamental alchemical truth that poison and medicine are often the same substance, distinguished only by dosage, preparation, and the wisdom with which they are applied. As you answer this call, remember that your healing work begins with yourself and radiates outward. You cannot give what you do not have, cannot lead others to places you have not been willing to go yourself. The wounded healer's first patient is always themselves, and this treatment continues throughout their life. Not because they are broken, but because healing is not a destination, but a way of traveling. Not a state to achieve, but a process to embody. The call of the wounded healer is ultimately a call to service, the kind of service that depletes and martyrs, but the kind that nourishes and fulfills, that transforms personal suffering into transpersonal medicine, that allows the most painful chapters of your story to become sources of healing for others who are still writing their own difficult pages. In answering this call, you discover that what was meant to destroy you has instead prepared you for a form of service that could emerge from no other source. A medicine that the world desperately needs, and that only you, in your particular wounded wholeness, are equipped to provide. There exists beneath the familiar terrain of personal memory and individual experience a vast underground ocean that connects every human soul to every other and primordial depth, where the universal patterns of our species flow like ancient rivers beneath the earth. When survival strips us down to our most essential core, when trauma peels away the accumulated layers of personal identity like bark from a winter tree, we find ourselves descending into this collective unconscious, this sacred repository of all human becoming. Jung called it the deepest layer of the psyche. But perhaps it is more accurate to say that the psyche itself is merely the surface ripple of this infinite depth. Here, in the archetypal realm, our individual story of survival and transformation reveals itself to be one thread in an enormous tapestry that has been weaving itself since consciousness first sparked in human awareness. The specific details of our personal trauma, the particular faces, places, and circumstances that brought us to our knees, begin to dissolve into universal patterns as old as humanity itself. In this descent, we discover that we are not the first to walk this path of destruction and renewal. The mother who has lost a child touches the same grieving current that flowed through Demeter when Persephone was taken to the underworld. The man betrayed by his closest friend drinks from the same bitter well that nourished the myths of brotherhood, broken and trust shattered. The woman who has faced her own mortality in the sterile corridors of a hospital corridor connects with the eternal figure of the wounded healer, the one who must journey to the edge of death to return with the medicine of deeper life. This recognition does not diminish our personal suffering, but rather places it within a context so vast and meaningful that our individual pain becomes sanctified, transformed into a form of communion with the deepest truths of human existence. We begin to understand that our survival story is not merely our own, but belongs to the great collective narrative of consciousness awakening to itself through crisis, breakdown, and eventual transcendence. The descent into this realm often occurs when our personal resources have been exhausted, when the familiar strategies of the ego can no longer carry us forward. It is as if survival itself demands that we reach deeper than our individual strength, deeper than our learned coping mechanisms, deeper even than our personal will to live. We must tap into something more fundamental, the archetypal force of life itself, the primordial drive toward continuation and renewal that has carried our species through countless trials and transformations. In this deepest layer of consciousness, we encounter not faults or memories, but images powerful, numinous symbols that seem to arise from the collective memory of humanity. The tree of life appears in our dreams, its roots extending into the darkness of death, its branches reaching toward the light of rebirth. The great mother figure emerges not as our personal mother, but as the eternal feminine principle that nurtures all life through its darkest passages. The wise old man or woman manifests, offering guidance that seems to come from the accumulated wisdom of all who have walked this path before us. These archetypal encounters cannot be understood through rational analysis alone. They must be felt, experienced, allowed to work their mysterious alchemy in the depths of our being. They come bearing gifts that our conscious mind could never devise. The gift of perspective that places our suffering within the great cycles of cosmic renewal. The gift of connection that reminds us we are never truly alone in our deepest struggles. The gift of meaning that transforms senseless pain into sacred initiation. Here, in this collective depth, we begin to understand why trauma often feels so much larger than our individual capacity to contain it. It is because trauma is not merely personal but archetypal. It connects us to the fundamental vulnerability of all conscious beings, to the essential fragility that makes courage possible, to the universal experience of separation that makes love so precious. Our specific wounds become doorways into the great wound of existence, itself the cosmic homesickness that drives all spiritual seeking, the existential loneliness that makes authentic connection so transformative. The collective unconscious does not offer easy comfort or simple answers. Instead, it provides something far more valuable: the recognition that our struggle is part of something infinitely larger and more meaningful than our personal circumstances would suggest. We discover that we are not victims of random misfortune, but participants in an ancient drama of consciousness, evolving through crisis toward greater wholeness and wisdom. In this recognition, our relationship to survival itself begins to transform. We are no longer simply trying to get through our personal ordeal, but participating in the timeless human journey of descent and return, death and rebirth, wounding and healing. We become conscious carriers of archetypal patterns, living out in our individual lives the great mythic themes that have guided humanity's psychological and spiritual evolution for millennia. The images and symbols that arise from this depth often feel more real and meaningful than the surface events of our daily lives. A dream of crossing a dark river may carry more transformative power than months of rational analysis. A vision of light emerging from profound darkness may offer more genuine hope than any amount of positive thinking. These archetypal encounters bypass the defenses of the personal ego and speak directly to the depths of our being, offering healing that occurs not through understanding, but through direct experience of the great patterns that govern all transformation. We learn to navigate this collective realm. We begin to recognize its influence in our daily survival process. The strength that carries us through our darkest moments does not arise merely from personal determination, but from our connection to the archetypal force of life itself. The same power that drives seeds to sprout through concrete, that compels wounded animals to heal, that moves individuals and communities to rebuild after devastation. We are borrowing from a reservoir that belongs not just to us, but to life itself. This descent also reveals why traditional therapeutic approaches sometimes feel inadequate in the face of profound trauma. Purely personal healing, while necessary, cannot fully address the archetypal dimensions of our wounding. We need not just individual recovery, but initiation into the greater mysteries of existence, an understanding of our place in the vast story of consciousness awakening to itself. Through suffering and transcendence, the return from this collective depth does not leave us unchanged. We carry back with us not just personal healing, but archetypal wisdom and codes that belong not just to our individual recovery, but to the greater human understanding of survival and transformation. We become bridges between the personal and the universal, living examples of how individual healing can serve the collective evolution of consciousness itself. In the end, we discover that survival is never merely personal. It is always part of the great work of existence itself, the endless process by which consciousness learns to embrace both light and shadow, both creation and destruction, both life and death, in service of an ever greater wholeness. Our individual journey becomes a sacred offering to this collective becoming. Our personal healing, a gift to the great healing that humanity itself is undergoing in its gradual awakening to the deeper truths of existence. Standing now with one foot in personal experience and one foot in archetypal depth, We are no longer simply survivors of our individual circumstances, but conscious participants in the eternal human story of transformation through crisis, growth through breakdown, and the endless renewal that makes all authentic life possible. There comes a moment in the journey of transformation when you find yourself suspended between worlds, neither the person you once were nor the being you were destined to become. This is the chrysalis of becoming, a sacred darkness that wraps around the dissolving self like nature's own cocoon of mystery. Here, in this liminal space that exists beyond the reach of ordinary understanding, the deepest alchemy of the soul begins its ancient work. Consider the profound wisdom contained within the metamorphosis of the butterfly. The caterpillar does not simply grow wings and learn to fly. No, it must surrender completely to a process so radical that it defies comprehension. Within the chrysalis, the creature literally dissolves its tissues, breaking down into what biologists call imaginal soup, a primordial substance that holds the blueprint for what is to come. The caterpillar dies to become something utterly different, utterly transformed. So it is with the survivor who has descended deep enough into their own transformation. You reach a point where the familiar structures of identity begin to dissolve, where the carefully constructed persona that once defined you starts to lose its coherence. The roles you played, the beliefs you held, the very sense of who you thought you were, of this begins to soften, to break down, to return to some more fundamental essence that exists before form, before definition, before the crystallization of identity. This dissolution is terrifying to the ego, which depends on solid ground, clear boundaries, and recognizable landmarks. The mind that is accustomed to knowing who it is and where it stands suddenly finds itself in a space of radical uncertainty. You wake each morning not quite sure which version of yourself will emerge from sleep. You look in the mirror and see features that are familiar yet somehow foreign, as if you were looking at someone you once knew intimately but are only now beginning to meet in this chrysalis state. Time moves differently. The linear progression of days and weeks becomes less relevant than the cyclical nature of internal seasons. There are periods of complete stillness, where it feels as though nothing is happening, where the temptation is to believe that you are stuck, stagnant, perhaps even regressing. Then there are moments of intense activity beneath the surface, invisible transformations that reorganize the very foundations of your being while you sleep, while you dream, while you go about the mundane activities of daily life. The sacred darkness of the chrysalis is not empty. Darkness, it is pregnant with possibility, alive with potential, dense with the intelligence of becoming. Within this space, something far older and wiser than your conscious mind takes over the process of transformation. It is the same intelligence that guides the growth of trees, the migration of birds, the healing of wounds. Jung called it the self, that archetypal principle within the psyche that knows the pattern of your wholeness, even when your ego has lost all sense of direction. This intelligence works through symbols, through dreams, through synchronicities that seem to emerge from the fabric of existence itself. In the chrysalis of becoming, you find yourself guided not by rational planning or conscious intention, but by a deeper knowing that communicates through the language of metaphor and myth. You may find yourself drawn to certain books, certain places, certain people, without understanding why. You may discover that your dreams have become more vivid, more meaningful, carrying messages that speak directly to the part of you that is being reformed. The dissolution that occurs within this sacred space is not destruction, it is a return to essence. Just as the caterpillar's tissues break down into imaginal soup while retaining the blueprint for transformation, Your own dissolution preserves what is essential, while releasing what no longer serves. The fears that once defined you begin to lose their grip. The limitations you accepted as permanent start to reveal themselves as temporary constructions. The stories you told yourself about who you are and what you are capable of begin to soften into possibility. In this liminal space, you encounter paradox in its purest form. You are simultaneously dying and being born, ending and beginning, losing yourself and finding yourself. The boundaries between inner and outer reality become permeable. Dreams feel more real than waking life. Metaphors become literal truths. The symbolic and the actual merge into a single stream of experience that cannot be understood through ordinary logic, but must be lived through directly. The chrysalis teaches patience of a kind that our achievement-oriented culture rarely acknowledges. This is not the patience of waiting for something to happen, but the patience of allowing something to happen through you. It is the patience of the seed in the dark earth, trusting in processes that cannot be seen or measured or hurried. It is the patience of the pregnant woman in her final month, knowing that the new life within her will emerge in its own time, according to its own deep wisdom. During this phase of transformation, the outside world may seem distant, irrelevant, sometimes even hostile to the delicate process occurring within you. Friends and family may express concern about your withdrawal, your seeming inactivity, your reluctance to engage with the demands and expectations of ordinary life. They cannot see the profound work being done in the darkness of your chrysalis. They cannot comprehend that what appears to be stagnation is actually the most dynamic transformation of your existence. The chrysalis also serves as protection, not just for you, but for the tender new being that is forming within the dissolution of the old, like the butterfly's cocoon. This psychological chrysalis shields the emerging self from premature exposure, from the harsh light of judgment, from the pressure to emerge before the transformation is complete. It provides a sacred container within which the impossible can become possible, within which the caterpillar of who you were can become the butterfly of who you are meant to be. Within this space of becoming, you learn to trust processes that cannot be controlled or managed. You discover that transformation has its own intelligence, its own timing, its own necessary stages that cannot be rushed or skipped. You learn to surrender to the mystery of your own becoming, to allow yourself to be guided by forces larger and wiser than your conscious understanding. As you remain within this chrysalis, you begin to sense the stirring of new capacities, new ways of being that were impossible within the constraints of your former identity. Like the wing buds forming within the dissolving caterpillar, these new aspects of yourself are still tender, still forming, still protected by the darkness that surrounds them. You catch glimpses of who you are becoming in dreams, in moments of deep meditation, in sudden flashes of insight that seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The chrysalis of becoming is ultimately about trust in the intelligence of your own transformation. Trust in the darkness that precedes new light. Trust in the dissolution that makes space for new form. It asks you to release your grip on who you think you should become and surrender to who you are actually becoming. It invites you to embrace the sacred uncertainty of metamorphosis, and to find peace in the space between no longer and not yet. In this liminal darkness, you discover that becoming is not something you do, but something you allow. Not something you control, but something you participate in with the whole of your being. The chrysalis teaches you that true transformation requires not just the courage to change, but the wisdom to dissolve. There comes a moment in the depths of transformation when you must learn, perhaps, the most challenging skill of all the arts. of holding paradox without demanding resolution. This is where the true work of integration begins. In that sacred space where opposites meet, not to cancel each other out, but to dance together in a new form of wholeness. Here, the psyche reveals its most mysterious gift, what Jung called the transcendent function, the soul's innate capacity to synthesize contradiction into coherence, to birth something entirely new from the marriage of irreconcilable opposites. You have traveled far enough now to understand that your survival story is not a simple narrative of victory over adversity. It is something far more complex, far more profound. It is a story that holds within itself both destruction and creation, death and rebirth, unbearable loss and unexpected gift. The challenge is not to choose one over the other, not to emphasize the positive while denying the negative, but to find a way to carry all of it, the full spectrum of your experience, as an integrated whole. This is where many stumble in their journey toward wholeness. The mind, conditioned by a culture that demands clarity, resolution, and simple answers, rebels against the notion that truth can be paradoxical. We want our trauma to be purely tragic or purely transformative. We want our survival to be either testament to our strength or evidence of our brokenness. We want clear categories, defined boundaries, stories that make sense according to the logic we have been taught. But the transcendent function operates according to a different logic altogether, the logic of the symbol, the dream, the mythic narrative that can hold contradiction without collapse. It emerges from the depths of the psyche when conscious thought reaches its limits, when the rational mind exhausts its capacity to understand or control. It is the psyche's own creative response to impossible situations, its way of finding a third path when only two options seem to exist. Picture yourself standing at the confluence of two rivers, one carrying the dark waters of your trauma, the other flowing with the clear stream of your resilience. The transcendent function is not about choosing one river over the other, nor about trying to stop that flow. It is about recognizing that where these waters meet, something new is created, a different kind of current that carries elements of both while belonging fully to neither. In the survivor's journey, dysfunction manifests as the gradual ability to say yes to the entirety of your experience, yes to the devastating loss, and yes to the unexpected strength, yes to the moments of despair, and yes to the flashes of transcendence, yes to the person you were before the catastrophe, and yes to who you became through it. This is not the superficial positivity that denies difficulty, but the profound acceptance that recognizes every aspect of your journey as somehow necessary, somehow part of the larger pattern of your becoming. The integration process requires you to become a living vessel for contradiction. You learn to carry within yourself the simultaneous truth of your woundedness and your wholeness. You discover that you can be simultaneously broken and healing, traumatized and wise, damaged and powerful. These are not stages to move through in sequence, but states to hold in dynamic tension, allowing each to inform and enrich the other. This capacity to hold paradox transforms your relationship with your own story. No longer do you need to present yourself as either victim or victor, as either damaged or triumphant. You can be all of these things at once, and in being all of them, you become something more than any single identity could contain. You become a living demonstration of the psyche's capacity for complexity, its ability to find meaning and purpose, even in the most contradictory circumstances. The transcendent function often manifests through symbols and images that bypass the rational mind entirely. You may find yourself drawn to certain artworks that seem to capture something essential about your experience, even though you cannot explain why. You may have dreams that present your journey through mythological imagery perhaps. You are simultaneously the hero and the dragon, the wounded healer and the patient, the one who dies and the one who is reborn. These symbolic expressions are not mere metaphors. They are the psyche's attempts to communicate truths that cannot be captured in linear, logical language. They point toward a way of understanding your experience that transcends the limitations of either or thinking, and opens into the vast landscape of both and reality in this space of integration. You begin to understand that your trauma was not something that happened to you and then ended. It was something that fundamentally altered the fabric of your being, becoming woven into the very structure of who you are. But rather than diminishing you, this weaving has created something more complex, more resilient, more capable of holding the full spectrum of human experience. You learn to see your scars not as evidence of damage, but as markers of transformation. Each one tells a story not just of wounding, but of healing, not just of breakdown, but of breakthrough, not just of what was lost, but of what was discovered in the place where loss occurred. Your wounds become windows through which wisdom enters, gateways through which compassion flows. The transcendent function teaches you that healing does not mean returning to who you were before. It means becoming large enough to contain who you were, who you became, and who you are still becoming. It means developing the psychological spaciousness to hold all of your contradictions without being torn apart by them. This integration is ongoing, never complete, always deepening. Each day brings new opportunities to practice holding paradox, to find the transcendent third option when faced with apparent opposites. You learn to navigate the world from this place of integrated complexity, speaking your truth while honoring its contradictions, sharing your story while acknowledging its multiple layers of meaning. Others may find this complexity confusing or unsettling. They may want you to be simpler, more easily categorized, more clearly defined. But you have moved beyond the need for such simplicity. You have discovered that truth itself is paradoxical, that wholeness includes brokenness, that strength can emerge from vulnerability, that wisdom can be born from confusion. In carrying your contradictions like sacred vessels, you become a living bridge between worlds, the world of ordinary consciousness that demands resolution and the deeper world of the psyche that thrives on mystery. You learn to translate between these realms, helping others understand that complexity is not confusion, that paradox is not contradiction, that holding opposites in tension is not weakness, but the highest form of psychological sophistication. The transcendent function, ultimately, reveals itself as love, large enough to embrace the entirety of your experience, wise enough to find meaning in meaninglessness, strong enough to transform poison into medicine. Through this function, you discover that integration is not about achieving a final, stable state of wholeness, but developing the capacity to dance with your contradictions, to find harmony not in resolution, but in the dynamic interplay of all that you are and all that you have become. Something has returned that you thought was lost forever, something that the fires of destruction seem to have burned away completely. Yet here it is, not restored but reborn, not recovered but revealed, the sacred dimension of existence itself, emerging from the ashes of your former understanding like a phoenix, whose wings span wider than anything you could have imagined before. The burning, this is not the sacred you may have known before, wrapped in the familiar garments of tradition and doctrine, housed in buildings built by human hands, mediated by intermediaries who spoke of mysteries they had learned about rather than lived through. This is something far more immediate and far more wild than humanist quality that Jung recognized as the direct encounter with the divine, unfiltered by institution or interpretation, arising from the raw material of existence itself. Having descended into the underworld of your own destruction and somehow found your way back to the surface, you discover that the landscape of ordinary reality has been transformed. Or perhaps it is your eyes that have been transformed, your capacity to perceive what was always present but hidden beneath the thick veils of assumption and habit that survival has burned away. The sacred has not returned, you have returned. To the sacred, to your capacity to recognize the holy that permeates every moment of existence. Like light filling water, it begins with the breath. How many millions of breaths had you taken without recognition, without gratitude, without the slightest awareness that each inhalation was a gift, each exhalation a release? Now, having known what it means to feel your breath grow shallow with fear, to gasp for air in the suffocating presence of what sought to destroy you, each breath carries the weight of miracle. The simple act of drawing air into your lungs becomes a prayer without words, a communion with the mysterious force that keeps you alive despite everything that has tried to stop you. This is not the romanticized spirituality of those who have never faced real darkness, not the shallow optimism that speaks of blessing while avoiding the reality of curse. This is the deep knowing that emerges only from having stood at the threshold between existence and non-existence and chosen, again and again, to step back into life. It is the sacred that has been forged in the crucible of genuine testing, authenticated by passage through the valley of the shadow of death. The survivor's encounter with the sacred carries a quality of immediacy that bypasses all theological complexity. You have touched the edge of the great mystery, felt the breath of forces far larger than human understanding, and this direct contact leaves you forever changed in your relationship to the divine. The questions that once seemed so important, which tradition is correct, which practices are most effective, which beliefs are most true, fade before the overwhelming recognition that the sacred is not something to be believed in, but something to be experienced, not something to be understood, but something to be lived. In this new relationship with the numinous, ordinary moments become charged with extraordinary significance. The morning light streaming through your window is not merely photons traveling through space. It is the daily resurrection of the world, the cosmic yes that counters every no, the affirmation that existence continues to choose itself despite all evidence that it might simply cease. The taste of water becomes a sacrament. The touch of another human being becomes a laying on of hands. The simple fact of waking each morning becomes evidence of grace operating at levels beyond comprehension. This is not a return to childish, magical thinking, but an arrival at what T.S. Eliot called the intersection of the timeless with time. Those moments when the eternal dimension of existence suddenly becomes visible within the temporal, when the sacred reveals itself, not as separate from ordinary reality, but as the very ground upon which ordinary reality stands. The survivor has learned to perceive with what the mystics called the eyes of the heart, to see not just the surface of things, but the depths dimension that gives everything its ultimate meaning. The organized religions of your past may seem inadequate now, their containers too small to hold the vastness of what you have experienced. Their explanations may ring hollow against the immediate knowing that has been burned into your consciousness by direct encounter with the forces of creation and destruction. Yet paradoxically, you may find yourself able to appreciate these traditions in new ways, recognizing in their symbols and stories the same universal patterns that you have lived through in your own flesh. The cross becomes not just a religious symbol, but a representation of the intersection between the horizontal plane of human suffering and the vertical dimension of transcendent meaning. The resurrection stories of various traditions become not just historical claims, but psychological realities that you have experienced in your own process of dying to who you were and being reborn as who you are becoming. The myths and metaphors that once seemed distant now pulse with the recognition of lived truth. This return of the sacred often manifests in ways that surprise you. You may find yourself moved to tears by the sight of wildflowers growing through concrete, recognizing in their persistence the same force that has enabled your own survival. You may experience profound reverence while washing dishes, sensing in the simple act of cleansing the same purification that has been occurring in the depths of your being. Even mundane encounters with other people become charged with significance, as you recognize in each human face the same mysterious presence that has sustained you through your darkest hours. The sacred dimension you now inhabit is not separate from struggle, but includes it, not opposed to suffering, but revealed through it. You have learned that the divine is not found only in the pleasant and peaceful moments, but blazes most clearly in the crucibles of transformation, speaks most audibly in the silence that follows the storm, reveals itself most completely in the very experiences that seem to deny its existence. This integration of sacred and ordinary creates a new way of being in the world. You move through daily life as one who carries a secret, but not a secret that needs to be hidden, rather a secret that longs to be shared, but can only be communicated through presence rather than words. Your very being becomes a testament to the reality of dimensions beyond the merely material. Your existence becomes living proof that something sacred operates at the heart of even the most devastating experiences. The return of the sacred is not a consolation prize for having suffered, but recognition of what suffering has revealed that beneath all the surface dramas of human existence flows an underground river of meaning, purpose, and love that no amount of destruction can ultimately touch. You have found your way to this river not despite your wounds but through them, not by avoiding the darkness but by allowing it to teach you where the light has been hiding all along. In this sacred dimension, gratitude becomes not an attitude you cultivate but a recognition you cannot avoid. Every moment of continued existence, every small pleasure, every connection with another being becomes cause for wonder rather than mere acknowledgement. You have known what it means to have everything stripped away, and this knowing transforms your relationship to everything that remains, everything that returns, everything that was always present but invisible to eyes that had not yet been opened by the particular clarity that only comes through the complete dissolution of everything you thought you knew. The sacred has returned, and with it, the recognition that it never left, that you are living, breathing, moving within the very mystery you once sought to find outside yourself. Every breath is prayer, every day resurrection, every moment an opportunity to participate consciously in the great, sacred unfolding of existence itself. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when you realize you no longer belong entirely to either world, not to the realm of those who sleep in the comfortable darkness of unconsciousness, nor to the distant shore of those who have completed their crossing. You have become something else entirely, a bridge suspended between two territories of human experience. Your very being stretched across the chasm that separates innocence from wisdom, destruction from creation, death from rebirth. This is, perhaps, the most profound loneliness the individuated soul must bear, to stand as translator between languages that seem to share no common alphabet. On one side, you hear the familiar cadences of those who have not yet been called to the fire. There, voices carrying the sweet certainty of unexamined assumptions, their steps light with the grace of untested beliefs. On the other, you sense the presence of those rare souls who have walked through their own annihilation and emerged as something unrecognizable even to themselves. Their silence, heavy with the weight of truths that cannot be spoken in ordinary words, and you exist in the space between. Your heart a constant translator, your presence a living testimony to the possibility of transformation. This liminal existence becomes both your burden and your gift, a sacred responsibility that was never chosen but simply emerged from the depths of your own becoming. You discover that survival itself has transformed you into an instrument of mediation, a bridge that others can cross when they are ready to leave one old for another. The language of innocence flows through you, still you remember its rhythms, its hopes, its beautiful blindness to the shadow that moves beneath all human endeavor. When you encounter those who have not yet been broken open, you find yourself able to speak their tongue, to meet them in the geography of their current understanding. Yet beneath your words runs an underground river of knowledge that you cannot fully reveal, for to do so would be like forcing someone to stare directly into the sun before their eyes have learned to see. You learn the delicate art of presence, without overwhelming, of sharing truth without shattering, of offering light without blinding. This requires a constant attunement to the soul's readiness in another, a sensitivity to the precise moment when someone stands at the threshold of their own descent. Too early, and your words become meaningless philosophy. Too late, and the opportunity for gentle guidance passes, leaving them to face their darkness alone. But it is perhaps with those who are currently walking through the fire that your bridge nature becomes most essential. Here, in the presence of souls being torn apart by forces they cannot yet understand, you become a lifeline cast into the chaos of transformation. Your very existence whispers the impossible promise. You can survive this. You can emerge from this dissolution not diminished but expanded, not defeated but reborn. To those writhing in the grip of their own shadow material, you offer the gift of witnessed suffering. You do not try to fix or heal or hurry that process, for you have learned that the fire burns according to its own sacred timing. Instead, you simply hold space for their agony. Your presence a constant reminder that someone has walked this path before and found a way through. In your eyes, they glimpse their own potential future, not the person they were, but the being they are becoming. This witnessing is perhaps the most demanding aspect of living as a bridge. To be present with another's destruction without being pulled back into your own, to offer hope without false comfort, to speak truth without cruelty. This requires a kind of psychological strength that can only be forged in the fires of your own transformation. You must remain anchored in your own hard-won wisdom while remaining fluid enough to meet each soul exactly where they are. The burden of this existence reveals itself in moments of profound isolation. At dinner parties, you smile and nod as conversations flow around topics that seem to exist in a parallel universe: complaints about minor inconveniences, excitement over achievements that feel hollow, fears about losses that pale beside the ego death you have survived. You find yourself translating constantly, not just your words but your very energy, dimming your light so as not to overwhelm, speaking in metaphors so gentle they barely carry the weight of what you know. Sometimes, in the deep hours of night, you feel the full weight of standing between worlds, the loneliness of being too changed for your old life, too human for complete transcendence, too aware for comfortable ignorance, too compassionate for cynical withdrawal. This is the price of becoming a bridge. You belong fully to neither side, but serve as a passage for others to cross. Yet within this burden lies a gift, so profound it transforms the very nature of existence. You discover that your bridge nature is not something you constructed, but something you have become, as natural and essential as breathing. Every conversation becomes an opportunity for soul work. Every encounter a chance to midwife someone's becoming. You realize that your own destruction was not just personal, but archetypal. You were being prepared to serve something larger than individual healing. The gift reveals itself in moments of grace. When someone thanks you for seeing them in their darkness, when your presence alone provides the courage someone needs to take the next step. When your story becomes the permission another soul needs to begin their own journey of transformation. You begin to understand that your suffering was not meaningless, but alchemical, transforming not just your own lead into gold, but creating a crucible where others might undergo their own transmutation. Living as a bridge means embracing a life of perpetual service to the individuation process itself. You become a servant of the unconscious, an agent of the self that seeks expression through every human soul. Your personal story becomes impersonal, a vessel through which the universal patterns of death and rebirth can manifest. This is perhaps the final surrender, releasing even your transformed identity to serve the greater work of conscious evolution. The bridge bearer learns to find meaning not in belonging to either world, but in facilitating passage between them. Your joy comes not from your own achievements, but from witnessing others discover their own capacity for transformation. Your peace arises not from resolution, but from accepting your role as a permanent resident of the threshold, a guardian of the space where one way of being dissolves into another. In quiet moments, you feel the vibration of souls crossing through your being, some moving from innocence toward experience, others emerging from their dark night into a new dawn. You are the ferry that carries them, the lighthouse that guides them, the bridge they walk across. This is your calling, your contribution to the great work of human becoming, to exist as proof that the impossible journey can be made. The destruction can birth creation, that the end can become the beginning. And so you learn to embrace this sacred homelessness, this holy loneliness, this profound responsibility. You are the living testament to transformation, the embodied promise that no darkness is final, no destruction complete. In your very existence, others glimpse the possibility of their own becoming. And in serving that possibility, you find the deepest meaning your reconstructed life can hold.